There is a map to a fortune in gold and silver, and it has been sitting in plain sight for nearly 70 years. Anyone can walk up to it. Anyone can read it. It is protected behind museum glass, photographed, translated, studied by some of the finest scholars of the ancient world. It names 64 locations. It gives distances in cubits. It tells you how deep to dig and which direction to walk. And still, no one has found the treasure. Not the archaeologists who searched with the original translation in hand, not the treasure hunters who came after them, convinced the scholars had simply misread a line. Not anyone in over 7 decades of trying. So either the greatest fortune of the ancient world is still buried somewhere beneath the hills outside Jerusalem, or someone, 2,000 years ago, left behind the most convincing lie in the history of archaeology. We still don't know which. The story begins, as so many great discoveries do, almost by accident. In the winter of 1946, a Bedouin shepherd near the Dead Sea threw a stone into a dark opening in a cliffside, searching for a goat that had wandered off. He heard something shatter. Inside the cave, half buried in dust, were clay jars packed with ancient scrolls. That single, unplanned moment set off one of the most important archaeological chapters of the 20th century. Over the next several years, archaeologists and local Bedouin combed through 11 caves near the ruined settlement of Qumran, then under Jordanian control. What they recovered was staggering. Close to 900 manuscripts, some far older than any biblical text previously known to scholars, pushing the earliest verified copies of Scripture back by centuries in a single stroke. Universities raced to fund new expeditions. Governments took notice. A lost goat had led to the discovery of a lifetime. But in March of 1952, inside a modest opening that would come to be known simply as Cave 3, the team found something that did not belong there at all. March the 14th, 1952. A team from the American Schools of Oriental Research was working through Cave 3, roughly 2 kilometers north of the main Qumran ruins. By now, the excavators knew what to expect. Fragments of parchment and papyrus, so fragile that a careless breath could destroy them. What they found at the back of the cave broke every expectation. 2 rolled cylinders, not parchment, metal. It was copper, alloyed with a trace of tin, hammered black and green with 2,000 years of corrosion. The text on its surface hadn't been written with ink at all. It had been struck, letter by letter, blow by blow, directly into the metal. Nothing like it had ever surfaced among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Every other manuscript at Qumran carried scripture, prayer, or communal law. This one had been built for something else, something that needed to outlast fire, outlast flood, outlast time itself. But there was a problem, one that would keep its message locked away for years. The corrosion had made the metal as brittle as old ceramic. To unroll it in the traditional way would be to destroy it. Scholars could see, faintly, that letters had been pressed into the surface. They simply could not read them. For nearly 3 years, the copper scroll sat in that condition, visible, tantalizing, and utterly silent. Qumran itself was already steeped in mystery long before the scroll arrived. Many scholars associate the settlement with a Jewish sect often identified as the Essenes, a community that, according to this widely held but still debated interpretation, withdrew into the desert to live by rigorous religious discipline apart from the wider society of Jerusalem. Cave 3 had yielded far fewer manuscripts than some of its neighbors, and what little it held
was badly deteriorated by centuries of moisture and heat, which makes the copper scroll's survival almost defiant by comparison. Every organic manuscript in that cave had begun to crumble. The copper had not. It had also been placed apart from the other texts, deliberately set at the rear of the cave, separate from the community's sacred writings. Some scholars read real intention into that placement, a suggestion that whoever hid it understood its contents to be fundamentally different from everything stored around it. Scripture was kept together. This was kept apart. To understand why a single scroll captivated the archaeological world for 70 years, you have to understand exactly how far it stood apart from everything discovered around it. It was the only manuscript at Qumran made of metal. It was composed in a distinctive form of Hebrew, closer to the practical, everyday language later used in rabbinic writing than to the elevated, literary Hebrew of the biblical scrolls.
And from its very first line, it read like nothing else in the collection. No prayers, no prophecy, no communal law. Instead, locations, landmarks, precise quantities of gold and silver, recorded with the flat, methodical tone of an inventory rather than a sacred text. Someone had sat down in careful and repetitive detail and recorded exactly where a fortune had been hidden, as if fully expecting that someone else, someday, would come looking for it. The question that has haunted historians ever since is simple to ask and almost impossible to answer. What could matter enough to be hammered into metal, built to outlast civilizations? The answer finally arrived in 1955 and 1956, when the scroll was shipped to the Manchester College of Science and Technology in England. There, using a specially designed saw, conservators sliced the two brittle cylinders into 23 thin, curved strips, carefully enough to expose the hammered text beneath the corrosion without destroying it in the process. What they uncovered stunned everyone in the room. The very first lines described a chest of silver, buried 40 cubits beneath the steps of a fortress in a valley, a weight of 17 talents. In the ancient world, a talent represented a substantial unit of weight. 17 of them in silver alone was already an extraordinary sum. And that was merely the opening line. Column after column, the pattern repeated. 64 entries in total. Ruins, systems, tombs, water channels, courtyards, staircases. Locations clustered largely around Jerusalem, Qumran, and Jericho, with a handful reaching further afield. Each entry followed the same quiet formula: a place, a landmark, and a precise quantity of gold, silver, sacred vessels, or offerings. Taken together, and if every figure is read literally, the 64 entries describe a fortune so vast that some scholars, calculating using ancient weight standards, have arrived at totals reaching many tons of precious metal. Which raises the question no historian has ever been able to fully answer. Could that possibly be real? Part of what makes the scroll so hypnotic is how close its directions come to feeling followable, and how completely that feeling falls apart the moment you try. Distances are measured in cubits. Directions point toward structures that may no longer exist, or that were never definitively identified in the first place. One place name recurs throughout the text more than any other: Kolit. And to this day, no scholar has been able to say with confidence where, or even what, it was. A town, a district, a name lost entirely to history. No one currently knows. Some locations do correspond to places still recognized today. The area of the Temple Mount, the Qumran Valley, and sites tied to the biblical Valley of Achor among them. Others have simply vanished, absorbed by centuries of rebuilding, reuse, and erosion. Imagine trying to follow one of these instructions today. A line might describe treasure buried beneath a specific step, inside a specific cistern, beside a specific ruin. To a first-century local, that would have been unmistakable. One exact spot, no ambiguity at all. But cisterns were common utilitarian structures throughout the region. Staircases were rebuilt, buried, or destroyed. Ruins from that era have been reused, demolished, or quietly folded into later towns. A single line that once pointed to one unmistakable place can now describe a dozen plausible hillsides across the same valley. Reading the entries in sequence feels less like scripture and more like overhearing a private conversation between two people who both already know exactly where they mean. And we, 2,000 years later, are the only ones left out of it. The search did not stay theoretical for long. In the years following the translation, several of the very scholars who had deciphered the text, including the British scholar John Allegro, organized expeditions into the Judean wilderness, following the scroll's directions as closely as the terrain allowed. They dug at sites that seemed to match its descriptions with real precision. They uncovered cisterns. They uncovered tombs. They found solid evidence of ancient occupation, consistent with a landscape that had once been active and inhabited. They did not find gold. In more than 70 years since the scroll's discovery, no expedition has recovered treasure that can be definitively linked to its inventory. Some searches turned up artifacts of genuine historical interest. None turned up the fortune the scroll describes. That absence has become, in its own way, as significant as a discovery would have been. It forces historians to confront a harder question than, where is the treasure? Namely, what exactly this document was ever meant to be. The search has never been confined to trained archaeologists either. Independent treasure hunters have mounted their own expeditions over the decades, often without official permits, drawn by language specific enough to sound like real coordinates. Regional heritage authorities have had to actively manage and at times restrict unauthorized digging at sites associated with the scroll, a tension between careful archaeological method and the pull of a genuine treasure hunt that has shadowed this document since the moment it was translated. So, what is the Copper Scroll, honestly? Scholarly opinion has clustered around a handful of possibilities. None has achieved full consensus. The leading theory holds that the scroll records a genuine treasure, very plausibly wealth connected to the Second Temple in Jerusalem, hidden for safekeeping during a moment of crisis, most likely the Jewish revolt against Rome that ended with the temple's destruction in the year 70. Under this reading, priests or temple officials, watching Roman forces close in, dispersed the temple's wealth across dozens of hiding places throughout the surrounding countryside, fully intending to recover it once the danger had passed. The danger never passed. Rome was never driven out, and whoever knew where that wealth lay never lived to record it anywhere else. Not every historian accepts that account. A second major theory, championed by earlier scholars, including John Allegro himself, ties the treasure specifically to the Qumran community rather than the Jerusalem temple. The accumulated wealth of a religious group hidden as Roman legions advanced during the same revolt. A third, quite different school of thought argues the numbers are simply too large to be believed. Some researchers propose the scroll may preserve folklore, legend, or even a symbolic literary composition rather than a literal accounting of physical wealth, an ancient treasure narrative rather than an actual inventory. Under this reading, the scroll would not point to any specific buried fortune at all, but would instead reflect a community's memory or imagination of a temple's wealth
after that temple was already gone. There is a fourth, quieter possibility worth naming, one raised less as a firm theory and more as a caution. Even a sincere record-keeper is not immune to exaggeration, scribal error, or second-hand information passed down inaccurately across a generation of retelling. Under this reading, the scroll may reflect a genuine, good-faith attempt to preserve the memory of real wealth, wealth that had simply grown larger with each retelling, long before it was ever hammered into copper. Recent scholarship has added a further layer of complexity. Research by Joan Taylor of King's College London, published in Biblical Archaeology Review, proposes that the scroll may date later than long assumed, potentially to the period of the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century, when Jewish refugees again fled into the Judean wilderness and sheltered in caves near Qumran. If correct, this would place the scroll's concealment decades after the temple's fall, which would not rule out temple wealth at all. As Taylor and others note, a functioning temple building was never strictly necessary for temple treasure, or the memory and stewardship of it to endure among displaced communities in crisis. What makes this debate so difficult to close is that every theory explains part of the evidence well and struggles with the rest. The sheer specificity of the locations argues against pure legend. The staggering scale of the treasure argues against a simple, literal accounting. No single theory currently explains every detail without leaving something unresolved. The debate remains open, and that, more than any single answer, is the honest state of modern scholarship. Strip away the theories, and what can actually be said with confidence? The scroll itself is real, physically verified, and available for continued study. Held today at the Jordan Museum in Amman. Its Hebrew has been translated with a high degree of confidence, even as certain words and place names remain genuinely disputed among specialists. The choice of durable copper over perishable parchment strongly suggests its authors intended the record to survive and to be found, a detail many scholars weigh as evidence against a purely fictional or symbolic origin, since hammering metal at that cost and effort for pure invention would be an unusual undertaking.
At the same time, no treasure matching the scroll's descriptions has ever been recovered, despite genuine and repeated searching. Several of the locations named in the text remain unidentified, and the true scale of the wealth described, taken literally, is difficult to reconcile with other surviving historical records from the period. Modern science has added further texture to the picture without suppling it. Metallurgical analysis of the copper has helped researchers understand how the sheets were manufactured and joined, offering clues about the resources and craftsmanship available to whoever produced it. Paleographic study of the lettering style has helped narrow the handwriting to roughly the 1st century, even as debate continues over exactly when the scroll was buried. None of it has dug up the treasure, but together these methods have moved the conversation from pure speculation towards something closer to informed, careful, and still unresolved scholarly reasoning. In honest terms, the evidence supports a real, deliberate inventory. It does not yet prove the treasure it describes was ever real, or that it still waits wherever it was originally hidden. Part of what keeps this mystery alive is the land itself. The Judean wilderness has changed enormously since the 1st century. Valleys have eroded, structures have collapsed, been rebuilt, or vanished beneath later construction entirely. Modern political boundaries make some areas difficult or impossible to excavate freely. A landmark that was obvious to someone standing there 2,000 years ago may simply no longer exist in any recognizable form. There is also the matter of language.
Certain words in the Copper Scroll appear nowhere else in surviving Hebrew literature. Scholars have debated their precise meaning for decades without full resolution. If even a handful of the location names have been mistranslated or misunderstood, entire search efforts could have been aimed at exactly the wrong hillside. And then there is the possibility that unsettles treasure hunters more than any other. Perhaps the treasure was found long ago, quietly, deliberately, by someone who left no written trace at all. Perhaps it was recovered in antiquity, precisely as its hiders always intended, and the scroll survived only because no one thought to destroy the record once its purpose had already been fulfilled. We may never know which explanation is correct. What remains certain is this: 2,000 years ago, someone stood in the Judean wilderness with a hammer and a sheet of copper and made a deliberate choice. They did not write on something that could burn or tear or dissolve into dust with the centuries. They chose metal. They chose permanence. Whoever they were, they believed, with total conviction, that someone would eventually come looking, that the war would end, that the temple or the treasure or the world they had known would somehow be restored. It never was. And so their message has waited in the dark for 2,000 years, patient as stone, for a reader who has still perhaps not yet arrived. Somewhere among those 64 descriptions, in cubits, in paces, in half-remembered ruins, an answer may still be sitting exactly where it was left, waiting for someone to finally understand where to look. History rarely hands us a finished answer. More often, it hands us a fragment, a scroll, a single hammered line of copper, and asks us to keep searching. If stories like this one, where the past still holds its secrets close, are the kind of mystery that stays with you long after the screen goes dark, then stay with us here. There are more scrolls to unroll, more ruins to walk through, and more questions still waiting for the right person to finally ask them.